The 19th African Investigative Journalism Conference will take place from today until Wednesday here in Johannesburg. And as part of this year's program, the continent's investigative journalists will gather to tackle a range of themes, including keeping safe while pursuing groundbreaking investigative stories, and also being a woman investigative journalist, and how recent waves of military coups, especially on the western part of the continent, have affected journalists. So to talk to us more about the 19th African Investigative Journalism Conference, we joined virtually by Professor Anton Harber, the conference's convener, and also Caxton Professor of Journalism at Wits University. Prof. Harber, good to have you with us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning. Hello?
I can hear you, Prof. We just seem to have a slight delay, but otherwise I can hear you, I can see you. So, Prof, let's just start by just explaining and contextualizing the African Investigative Journalism Conference and what exactly its significance is.
Certainly. It's we gathered together Africa's investigative journalists from across the continent. We've been building this conference for 19 years. And every year we've got more people, more countries, and a richer and fuller program. So the idea is to highlight the best of African journalism and to encourage collaboration across borders, among groups of journalists, because so much journalism, particularly investigative journalism these days, is collaborative and is best when it's collaborative. And a lot of it is about training in the latest skills and tools and techniques, because there's new online forensic digital tools being launched every week.
Professor, now there is consensus among journalists, at least, that investigative journalism and journalists is under threat at the moment globally. For others who may not be part of the profession, how would you explain to them that this is indeed the case?
You know, we did a survey of 500 or 600 African journalists to prepare for this conference. And when we asked them what they most wanted to talk about, it was two things. The first was artificial intelligence. Obviously, that's the new big thing. But the second was safety, personal safety. And we talk about four kinds of safety in which journalists are very severely threatened. Their physical safety, their digital safety, because there's enormous online harassment of journalists, particularly women journalists, their psychological safety and their legal safety. So one of the things we do is we run a clinic here for journalists to get expert advice on looking after themselves in all those spheres. And I can tell you that particularly from the Sahel region, what we're hearing is that journalists are working under very difficult conditions, from state pressure, from pressure from militant groups. It's harassment, it's threats, and some of it is really ugly and really worrying.
And Professor, at a time when money, of course, is a concern across all spheres of journalism, when it comes to safety, what could be done? You know, how does a newsroom actually leverage on the meager resources that it may have to ensure that its journalists are in fact safe?
Yes, well, the first thing that has to be done is train journalists to be aware of the risks, to assess the risks and what steps to take. And that training is essential. And we're finding that many African journalists don't have access to that training. So part of what we do here is we give that training. But, you know, every newsroom, when they send somebody on a risky story, needs to assess that risk and take necessary measures. Because no story is worth endangering a journalist's life. And there's no doubt the threats out there are very severe, are greater than ever. So it's a very big issue we are going to be discussing in the next few days.
And an interesting one, Prof, because as a journalist, obviously your employer, the newsroom, will assess the danger, but at what point is it acceptable for a journalist to say, well, I am not going on this assignment because I fear for my safety in this instance? And, would that be fair, a fair discussion to have with your employer? And would they obviously, have any sort of obligation to actually listen to the journalists and pull them from the story?
Well, I think you would first have to sit down with your employer and say, can we assess this risk together? Can we do that properly and systematically? And then are there measures we can take to help manage that risk? So a last measure would be to say, look, this is too dangerous, I'm not going. And I think your newsroom and your employers should be making the same decision. But I think first you look for ways if you can manage it reasonably, because, of course, as journalists, our priority, apart from our safety, is to cover the story. So we like to first try and manage the risk rather than not cover the story. And then you have to work out the best ways to cover the story without putting yourself in the place of risk.
As far as the tools of trade are concerned, Prof, we've assessed the risk. We've tried to at least theoretically ensure that all the boxes are ticked. But in terms of just sending a journalist out with the necessary kit in terms of resources, let's talk about that, because that is something that's important, but equally it could become a costly issue as well.
No, definitely. There's no question your employer, your newsroom, should be providing you with equipment you need. And that can range from helmets to flak jackets, to the right communication equipment, and to the right training. So journalists are owed this as a condition of their work. And we really have to push to make sure that all journalists have it. And when we talk about investigative journalism, Prof, some of the issues that we are faced with in the newsroom, we spoke about the budgets and how that is shrinking all the time. So you find yourself in a situation these days where you perhaps get some tip-offs, but you literally do not know how to proceed because the newsroom may simply not have the resources to go after very important stories. How can we, as a fraternity overall, mitigate for that? So what we do is we often work with funds that provide that kind of support. So, for example, I run the Henry Ngomalo Foundation, and it gives support to individual journalists or newsrooms who have a good story, an investigative story that they can't pursue. And there are others who do it, like the Pulitzer Center in New York. So a lot of what happens here is conversation between people who support investigative journalism and who understand that many newsrooms don't have the resources in these difficult times, and try and give that support. But the collaboration you see at this conference is a critical part of that, because very often you can't do it alone. You need to work with people in other journalists, other newsrooms, other countries. And that often makes it less costly and enables you to do the story. So enabling that collaboration, putting people together to collaborate is a very important part of what we need to do.
And I'm asking this deliberately, Prof, because I actually found myself in a situation last week speaking about precisely this. So the funds that are available, is that available to everyone from any newsroom?
Well, different funds have different conditions. So mine focuses on certain countries, for example, and others focus on other countries. And obviously there are often not conditions on the content, conditions under who's eligible for them. But we're working hard to expand this to make as much available as possible. Resources are a big challenge. There's no question. There's no question that resources are a big challenge, and it's one we have to constantly address.
Professor Harber, one of the highlights of this year's program is, of course, the Carlos Cardoso Memorial Lecture, which will focus, as I understand, on the harrowing experience of being a woman investigative journalist. Can we just talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, every year as part of the conference, we commemorate Carlos Cardoso, who was a Mozambican journalist and a graduate of this university where I am at the moment, Wits University, which hosts the conference, who was assassinated. He was a journalist who was assassinated in 2001 or 2 while investigating corruption in Mozambique. So every year we hold a memorial lecture, and the purpose of that lecture is to focus on issues of media freedom in African countries and to highlight places where there are particular problems. This year our speaker is Mariam Odrego from Burkina Faso, an extraordinary journalist who's been extraordinarily courageous, and she's going to talk particularly about doing this work, this tough investigative work as a woman journalist.
And certainly looking forward to hearing some of those insights and, sharing in these experiences, Prof. But the inaugural AIJC African Investigative Journalism of the Year Award will also be awarded this year. So what is the criteria that judges will use to select the recipient?
Yes, it's the first time we're doing this, and we look for the best executed and the most impactful investigative story done across the continent. We look at how they did it. We look at the impact it had. We looked for innovation in the way they did it. And the importance, the public interest value of the story. It's got to be a story of great public interest. And I must say, we had about 200 entries, and we saw some extraordinary, fantastic work. So the 4 shortlisted and the winner who will be announced tomorrow night, I think the judges have had a tough time identifying the best of our journalism because, we don't know a lot about it, but there's fantastic and interesting and powerful work being done across the continent.
Indeed, Prof, and when you go to these conferences is where you actually get to see and you marvel at the work that journalists do under very hostile and very difficult conditions. But in terms of attendance, for those who maybe are only hearing about it now or would love to attend in one way or another, is there any way, hybrid sittings for any of the sessions? How does it work, Prof?
The plenary sessions, of which there are 4, are being live streamed. So people can people can follow us on social media to get those links and the times, etc. They can go to our website to get the details. Our website is aijc.africa. So that's www.aijc.africa. And there you can find out what you can watch live, and you can see the program, and you can even register and come along if you wish.
Oh, Professor Anton Harber, thank you so much for speaking to us about this year's edition, the 19th Africa Investigative Journalism Conference. And Professor Harber is the convener and also Caxton Professor of Journalism at Wits University. And as you heard there, you are able to stream this online. So if you want to be a part of it, you're absolutely welcome to do so. And I tell you, there are always such great stories and such great learning opportunities at these conferences. So do yourself a favor, especially if you're a student or someone who's working in the profession, to actually take some time to listen and join in. Right, that's where we're going to leave it.